applause.
All right, my name's Ryan. You guys, I haven't posted the slides yet, but I will afterwards, so if you want to grab these. I have a lot of slides, not a lot of slides this time with like the actual commands in them, but I'll try to keep it high level for the talk part, and you guys can go look up the commands later if you want. But yeah, this is part 4 of attacking Active Directory, the kind of rounding up the owning of the domain. We're going to start off with a quick review of level 1, 2, and 3. Then we're going to jump into some lateral movement techniques, and then finally pwning the domain, and actually some stuff on some defenses. You can go home right after this talk, because I know you guys want to go right back to work and start fixing up your Active Directory environments. So the review first. In the first talk, we talked about the basic theory of like what I do as an attacker once I am going after your Active Directory or just your company as a whole. We start out by trying to obtain some credentials. We looked at different ways of harvesting emails and then trying brute force attacks like on email servers or Citrix servers or VPNs on the outside. Once we get inside, we've got creds, we look like a normal user. Then we're going to start branching out and see where that user can go. We're going to look and identify where our access is. And then we're going to try to migrate to where that user can go and obtain more credentials. And we kind of keep looping through that until we find our high privilege domain admin credentials or something close to. And that was the basic theory talk. And we talked about initial footholds there with the default credentials on applications and the password spraying. And then some of the points we like to pick on that don't require any exploits, but just guessing some passwords and jumping in. In the next talk, we talked about the command and control setup that an attacker is going to use or need to use. We kind of have like a good, better, best setup for that, where you can get real crazy with chained redirectors, set up stuff in the cloud and do domain fronting, and have separate payload stagers, crazy stuff like that. And then last time, we talked about the host enumeration, doing it like locally on every box you get to, a bunch of stuff you want to look for, like passwords on that machine. You can profile the company's software they use, look for other users on those boxes, and then grepping through a bunch of sensitive files looking for more, mostly credentials. Then we moved on to the network enumeration side, and we're trying to identify those privileged users and who they are, where they're at, like where they're logged in. And then once we found our current user's access, we tried to identify those attack paths to get us to domain admin. We reviewed the club AD, where I tried to explain ACLs, DACLs, SACLs, and ACEs. And then Bloodhound, the tool that kind of automates a lot of looking through all that. And that's kind of a Bloodhound graph. And then this was kind of like the whole attack path theory in more of a graphical view, where Bob up there has a session on a machine that John also has a session on, and then Mary's a member of the SQL admins group, and she can access a box that there's a DA logged into, and so we can follow that chain through without really using any exploits, but just taking credentials and abusing our current users' rights and access to get there. So for this one, we're going to start off with the actual movement, the lateral movement part of this. And lateral movement's important for both defenders and attackers. It's where the attackers are going to spend a lot of their time, because it's once they get inside the network, they don't necessarily want to be triggering AV and firing off exploits or anything. They're just going to be trying to move around the network as quiet as they can, but they spend a lot of time there. Smokescreen put out some review that said they spend 80% of the time during lateral movement. Microsoft has also agreed that most of the time gets spent. They say months. I don't know why it would take months to do a lot of this. A lot of times it's a lot faster than that. But you do have some time here to try to identify when you have malicious users in your network. And the problem that makes that hard is a lot of times now everyone's just using built-in tools, and so they look like normal users on the network. They're just maybe doing things that that user wouldn't normally do, and that's the kind of stuff you can key off of. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the defenses towards the end, but when you have a normal domain user that all of a sudden has ps-exec'd into like 20 machines that day, and they've never used ps-exec before, then you can kind of think maybe something's going on with that guy. And again, yeah, there's just no really exploits being used here. We're just abusing the privileges and access we have inside Active Directory because it's such a complex environment. So for the tools, there's a lot of options for attackers, and you probably use these every day, accessing, like, you know, there's just a lot of different ways you log in and access resources, from Telnet to, maybe you probably don't use ps-exec, but like PowerShell and PS Remoting. And then for attackers, we get some of the stuff you wouldn't use, but like pass the hash and pass the tickets and relay attacks. I'll just go through a couple of them that kind of matter. RDP is still used definitely by attackers, and that's going to look like normal traffic to a lot of people. The nice thing about RDP is it doesn't require local admin access to do. You just need to be part of the remote desktop users group. And so when you don't have local admin access, you can't do some of those ps-exec type things, and you have to actually get out of the command line. It slows down the attackers quite a bit. But there's also VNC. VNC is kind of just the Linuxy Mac side of remote desktop. I find inside networks a lot, you'll find that they have VNC set up with no authentication, and then you can just fire a VNC viewer and pop in, and you've got instant access to someone's desktop, and you can just sit there and play with their mouse and watch them work and mess with them a little bit. But a lot of people think that their internal network is just safe because their perimeter is secure, but they're not looking at when one of their users has been compromised, and there's just people walking around the network using default creds to log into everything. Sysinternals, I'm just bringing up because of the next few tools. Sysinternals from Microsoft has just a whole suite of different kind of admin and access tools. There's sysinternals live at https://live.sysinternals that you can actually just access in File Explorer and essentially have ps-exec or a lot of different tools that you might need as an attacker instantly on a system. And that's like trusted by Microsoft, so it's an easy way to get some of these things on there. ps-exec I talk about first because it's kind of like the old school way of moving around the networks. It's pretty loud and gets detected very easily. It leaves a lot of log events. There's a ps-exec service that gets created while you're ps-exec'd into something. And defenders have known about that for a long time, and so there's a lot of logging and everything built around that, but it's still useful. The thing about logging stuff is if no one's looking at those logs, then it doesn't really matter from an attacker's perspective if they're logging you or not. In Metasploit, it is built in, which makes things nice if you use some interpreter shells and such. There's also a PowerShell version that will essentially just do the same thing, but you can launch PowerShell commands directly instead of getting a command shell. And then also in Empire, you can invoke a ps-exec. PowerShell Remoting is another tool attackers can use, but it's actually Microsoft's recommended way for doing remote administration, with like a whole bunch of caveats that you're using it correctly, because there's a lot of ways that you can mess it up, and there's something called the two-hop problem. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's like where if you want to admin, you're on box A, and there's box B and C, and you want to admin box B, so you enter PowerShell remote session into B. If you're using it correctly, you're not bringing any delegation creds with you, which means that you're only able to access stuff on that machine. Well, administrators want to be able to make a hop through B and work on C, but what they end up doing is bringing credentials with them to box B and basically exposing it and not using the remoting how it's supposed to, and it kind of cancels out the whole thing. But it uses WinRM, which is like Microsoft's implementation of the web services for management, or WS management. It's not the same as just using computer name after any just normal PowerShell commandlet. That uses RBC most of the time, which will still bring like credentials with you. When you do use it correctly, it will run as a service under the network service account of that box, and it spawns in an isolated process anything you run. And so if an attacker hijacks that user, they're kind of stuck in that little box. You can and should use just enough administration, really. So you have like PowerShell profiles set up, so that basically whenever you PowerShell into something, you can actually only run certain commands that you've set up that were allowed in that. That's the whole just enough administration. It just gives you just enough commands to do whatever you want to do without giving out just all the keys. The attackers I don't try to use this very much because it's very loggable. It's very verbose logging with easy to get tracks for people trying to tie it back to you. But I'll bring it up anyways. You can like invoke command or enter PS session. Enter PS session kind of is like probably the better way. It gives you an interactive shell like right away. You basically are just running PowerShell then on the remote box, but on your own screen. WMI is the preferred way for the attackers, like currently. That's what we tend to use the most. It's got the least like logging built in. It is loggable, but it comes pre-installed on all Windows systems all the way back to 98, so you know it's going to be there. It doesn't leave any files written to disk. There's no registry changes. It stores everything in these WMI repository objects. It uses DCOM as the protocol. DCOM is kind of like the new hotness for a lot of attacks. You'll see DCOM mentioned in a lot of these newer attacks. It's heavily used in the Windows OS, which is why attackers like it, because it's not something you're just going to go disable, because it breaks things like even Windows Update uses WMI to do its updating. So it's not something they can just disable, and it looks like a lot of other traffic. This kind of became popular as an attacker thing, or at least recognized by the defensive community in 2010 with the discovery of Stuxnet. I think it was like the first major like exploit tool that was found to be using WMI, and it might be a reason that it maybe hadn't gone detected for so long, and they think it was maybe used as early as 2005, is because no one was really looking at WMI. It works with a lot of like if this then that type like of triggers. It bases like a lot of stuff off events that occur, and then it will, if this event occurs, it'll fire something. There's a whole like architecture that I'm not even fully sure how all that works underneath. I just know the tools, and if you use WMI, no one's really looking at that stuff. It is actually easy to detect if you're looking at it though. Nearly all the operating system actions can fire and will fire WMI events that you can set up alerting on. You set up event subscriptions on these things. Kanza by Dave Hull actually does have all this kind of stuff built into it too, where it can detect WMI's things. It leaves logs all over the place. The only problem with the setting up the event subscriptions for different things is that an attacker with the right access can also just remove those event subscriptions. But luckily, not a lot of people are looking at that right now. And it's sort of hard to do, but that's what PowerShell 6.0 is coming out with, and some recent talks from the Blue Hat Tel Aviv, Microsoft's conference over there. Their like ATA team came out and talked a lot about PowerShell 6 and how they're going to start tracking a lot more of the WMI stuff. WMI exec is the tool kind of to use, or I'll talk about craft map in a second, but WMI exec, it's a built-in in Kali. It's a part of Impacket, which Impacket does like every protocol you can come up with in Windows, you can do with the tool in Impacket. It's pretty intense. It's a huge library, but it's really useful. There's Empire modules for it. It's the default way crackmap exec tries to do any of its commands. It's pretty simple to use. It works just like a PS exec or something, where you feed it a user and password, and then the command you kind of want to run remotely on the box. It also accepts hashes. You can do pass the hash attacks with this thing. SMB exec uses like named pipes to do the same kind of thing. It's almost exactly the same everywhere else, except for it just talks differently. Another Kali built-in, part of Impacket. Empire modules. It's CME's like last ditch effort of trying something. The nice thing about using like SMB pipes to talk on the network is that a lot of Windows services also use those, and so you can kind of blend in with the rest of the traffic. It also supports pass the hash, simple to run, and you just run these off any machine basically if you have some credentials, and it'll fire off for you. Crack map exec, I'd really like to see someone do like a full, like you could probably do a series on crack map because it does so much stuff. But it attempts 3 different command execution methods, and I use this a lot like from an attacker's perspective, because like I really don't need to be on Windows machines. I can just do everything from my Kali box and just pivot through stuff. But anytime it tries to send a command like who am I, it's going to first try it using WMI, and then it'll try AT-exec, which I just learned today actually that AT-exec actually does use SMB, but it just uses it to set up a scheduled task, so it doesn't have to keep as much traffic going. So it'll schedule a task, kind of wait for that callback to happen, and then get the results. And then lastly, it will try just to set up an SMB pipe over to that box. But crack map's awesome. You can like spray passwords all over. You can like run, if you have credentials with local admin access, you could basically run mimikatz like on the whole network and just receive just everyone's passwords and hashes back. So that's a really useful tool for attackers. It's got a lot of other modules too, but that's all I'm talking about today. As far as passing hashes, so Microsoft's like half said that they fixed pass the hash and relay attacks, but they didn't really. You can perform pass the hash attacks with NTLM hashes still. You can't perform pass the hash attacks with net NTLM hashes, which is something you'll get if you run something like Responder, but you can relay net NTLM hashes. It was since MS-08-068 that you couldn't relay those hashes back to the same machine, but if you've got local admin somewhere else with that user, you can relay them to some other box. So pass the hash isn't totally fixed, I guess. And a little bit into that without getting too deep, but like a normal auth is like if you want to access a resource on a different box, you say, hey, I'd like to log in to that box, and it presents you, it says like, hey, encrypt this challenge with your password hash, and then you return it, here's the encrypted challenge, and then it's like, if I can decrypt that, you use the right password, you can log in. And what the relay attack is you're kind of like man in the middling that same thing, where you see them try to log in somewhere, but you capture that and send it to somebody, and then you wait for them to respond to you with their encrypted, like, hey, we encrypted this, is that correct? You forward that back to the originating server, they give you that challenge, you forward that on, that will work, because you don't even know what that key is, but it was used. It gives you access, but you just don't return that back to the originating server.
Hey, Ryan.
Yeah.
Hey, I just want to have a real quick second to tell Brian thank you very much.
Oh, wow.
So, it's not often we have a 4-part series talking about a single topic. So, Ryan, we have a tradition here at SecKC. When you give a 4-part series, you get a shot. Oh, we should have 4 shots. Anyway, I want to hear it super loud for Ryan. Let's hear it up. All right, thanks. Continue.
All right, I get it. I'm through the boring stuff, okay? Like, all right, so we got through some explaining Responder there. Responder, there's also in Bay. That's kind of like you can run all of like, well, not all of, but some of Responder's stuff in PowerShell though. As far as like, Responder is really useful inside networks. If you don't have any user's credentials, but you've got access inside, so like maybe you got, like you plugged in a box inside their network physically and like it remoted back out to you, but you don't have any creds, well, you can use different exploits, real exploits, and force victims to give you their creds. Basically, anytime you set up like a UNC path, it's going to use authentication and present a hash back to, like, so you'd set up responder, use some sort of exploit, so you tell that machine to use a UNC path to access a resource. A really neat one with SQL is to do a into out file, and then you point that out file on your remote box that's listening, and it'll send you creds. So responder is really useful if you don't have creds. You can also run it in like analyze mode, and it basically just sits there and listens on the network and looks for, because there's a lot of things that require authentication, and you can just sit there and listen on the network and just watch creds go by. And you can crack net NTLM hashes. It's a lot harder, but it is doable. And so like that's kind of a way you can just harvest credentials or move around if you relay it. But yeah, they send an attack, auth request, relay to the victim, and you win. But the funner stuff is finally just like owning that whole domain. So you've moved around the network. We saw the talk last time about Mimikatz and how easy it is just to get credentials from all over the place, and they're always in memory. So basically what you're doing is just moving box to box with any of those techniques. I use CrackMap, and we'll basically just check for local admin access. If I've got it, I can just run Mimikatz and get more users, and then feed that into my Bloodhound instance that's running, and just looking for where all those users are at. But what's it really mean to own the domain? Is that just getting all the passwords? A lot of times you maybe are looking for some kind of loot, or access to everything. Not everything is in Active Directory, right? There's like all those Linux systems and such, but the nice thing about, usually once you own the Active Directory, is that you've got access to all their workstations. You can log into those and take their SSH keys or whatever they're using to monitor the Linux systems. You want to look at what's important to that company and what do they value. A lot of times you don't even need to own the whole domain to get to what you want. Basic users have access. They'll have stuff on public shares that shouldn't be there. Maybe you want to look at becoming an enterprise admin, because domain admin isn't really the top tier guy. You might just be owning this domain, but there might be 5 other domains in the forest that you want to get a hold of, and the enterprise admin's where you want to be. And then, yeah, the Unix environments. So for me, I like to first get in there and own all the users, get that NTD file, and then identify the VIPs. The fun thing about identifying VIPs is like that's where you go after the president of the company and go look him up, and then add whatever accounts you have to his like CEO, like the CEO's inbox, and then you can pop open his Outlook and look at his emails, and those always make for great presentations when you've got the CEO's most recent email. You might, depending on the type of engagement you're doing, set up long-term persistence. Like you'll set up some shells that only call back once every week or so. And then you'll just really start gathering all the loot and start exfiltrating and try to get stuff out of the network that you're looking for. Because once you kind of have the whole domain owned, then it makes it a lot easier to do all the recon and stuff you need to, because now you know where everything's at and you have access to everything you need. Where are domain admin credentials at? There are a few different ways domain admins, I see a lot, like why they leave their credentials somewhere. And maybe they don't always know that they're doing that. Really they shouldn't be using their domain admin account for most of the work they're doing, but logging into a computer with a domain admin account is going to put the credentials there. We know that one. Logging onto a computer with a user account and then entering domain admin credentials to do something like a run as, well, that's going to cache those domain admin credentials on that box too. Then there's trickier ones, like if you logged onto a computer with a user account and you want to RDP somewhere with a domain admin account, it'll actually cache those domain admin credentials on the box that you use to initiate the RDP connection, because it'll use that for that RDP connection. And then services deployed to workstations that run under the context of a domain admin account. I've seen, like, one of the guys that I work with owned a network once by taking over the McAfee service, because the McAfee service was in the domain admins group and was on every single box in the whole domain. So basically you're leaving domain admin creds on your entire network. It's very rare that a service account should need domain admin credentials. The people selling it to you or whatever probably tell you that, but it's probably just some right that they need that you can give a user, and they really don't need to be a domain admin. Getting all the user's password requires the ntds.did file. It's on every domain controller. It's a database file that's hosted on C Windows, NTDS. This basically, without getting like really into it, it just has everything about Active Directory in it at every time. And all the DCs need this so that they can do authentication requests and they can service, they know where all the sessions are at. It stores just everything. And so if I can get to that file, that's what I really want. And there's ways you can get to that file without being a domain admin. There's users that you can compromise that can log into domain controllers, like backup operators, account operators, and print operators. They can all log into domain controllers, and then I can just hash dump the DC and get all the passwords. Backup locations, we've seen backups of the NTDS files stored on file shares and on different backup servers. And that's why a lot of that enumeration part is important, because you're looking for these sensitive files that maybe are being stored somewhere they should not be. And then some of the like really specific scenarios, like if you have admin rights on a virtualization host, and you have a virtual DC, you can just clone that DC and then take that image with you. And then another one with the NTDS file staged on a member server that's going to be promoted to a DC. That's probably a rare occurrence, but it is out there. I think I took that one from like Sean Metcalf's blog. Getting that file itself, there's a few different techniques you can do. Obviously on the box, you can run things like Mimikatz, hash dump. There's a tool called NTDS grab, Windows credential editor, and secret dumps, which is part of that impacket tool we talked about. The volume snapshot service is a slightly popular one that can be useful. And Ninja Copy is basically the PowerShell version of doing a volume snapshot, which basically tells the DC that I need to take a backup of the NTDS file, take a backup of it, but give it to me afterwards. And then DC Sync is kind of like the one I prefer to run now, because it doesn't require me to ever even log into a DC. DC Sync's cool. It is fairly simple to really understand. Like it's kind of confusing how it really works, but basically it's going to look for the nearest domain controller and then request that domain controller to replicate the user credentials to me, because I look like a domain controller. You don't have to have a domain admin account. This is actually part of a domain controller account that actually has these privileges, which is the DS replication get changes and DS replication get changes all. I won't get too much into that more, but when we talked about Bloodhound and the ACL collection method, one big part of that was that they started looking for those privileges on every object in the whole domain to see if any other computers had it or users, because sometimes people think that they can just set up groups that aren't called the domain admins, but have all those rights, and think they're safe because they called them like non-domain admins or something more clever than that, clearly. But that's why the Bloodhound started collecting all those ACEs, those entries, because it's looking for those different rights to get us there. DC Sync, I really like this because it enables a user with tier 0 privileges to imitate a domain controller. And so how this kind of works is like, you're an attacker and you've got a shell on a box. And that domain admin Steve guy, he either left creds on that machine, or he's logged into the box currently so we can impersonate his user, or we just got his creds way earlier and we're just logging into the system because we want to go get an updated snapshot of everyone's passwords. The attacker is going to basically make that host look like a domain controller. First, they're going to try to imitate it with domain admin credentials is what you need, because that's what can create new domain controllers on the network. So first you're going to impersonate the DA. Then you're going to turn that box into appear like it's a new DC on the network. Then you're going to tell the closest DC, hey, I'm a DC and I'm out of sync with everybody. I need a copy of the NTDS file. And it's basically going to say like, okay, you're a new DC, you've got the right rights, here you go. And now I never had to actually get on a domain controller, but I stole the whole Active Directory, basically profile for everybody. And then the attacker can laugh and run off with all their goods. It's really simple to run once you have the right rights. You can call it with PowerShell directly. There's Empire modules for it. Mimikatz has modules for it. I think he ran one last time. When it comes back through, this is kind of just a picture of if you're in PowerShell and you're running as one of those domain admin accounts, like you stole the token or something we talked about earlier, you run it and you just wait, and then it'll start firing back all the domain users and all their passwords. And what it's really doing is getting a copy of the NTDS file and the system file in that DC. The system file is used to decrypt the ntds.dit file, but it only decrypts the file access itself, and then inside the file is still hashes, but we take those offline to a password cracking rig and just start running them through, because NTLM is fairly simple to crack. We have a pretty weak, honestly, password cracking rig, but we can run the entire 8-character namespace, or like every 8-character password you can possibly have, which is Active Directory's default. We can do that in like 6 hours. And that's like one of the weaker ones. Some of the guys that have like 10 NVIDIA cards set up, I think last year at Black Hat, someone had said they could do every 13 character password in like 2 days. And so the whole like password thing kind of goes out the window once you're just using defaults, and we can crack them just really quickly. Kind of the old school way, which we don't use anymore because it's too noisy, it would be to log into the DC itself and then just run a hash dump. DCs work a little differently, where their SAM database is going to control all the domain users' passwords. Most computers don't have that. They've only got whoever logged in recently and then the local accounts. But I just thought I'd point that out. And so to kind of bring this full circle, like just to remember everything we talked about, like this is an attack we used like fairly, like in the last year, I just kind of was looking through like what's a good one that had a few steps. A lot of times it's a lot less steps than this, unfortunately, because domain admins are logged in all over the place. In this case they weren't, which made it take a little longer, but it's still doable. But we started with Harvester, search the internet for emails, basically, and then use Sublister to brute force domains. Found a Citrix server on their site. We used Burp Suite to basically do a password attack using all the emails we had with like fall 2017 and summer 2017. You just pick some really basic passwords. They're in the top 10 list. And if you have like 500 users, it's pretty sure one of them is going to have one of those weak passwords. We're able to get into the Citrix environment, launched Word up. Citrix is really hard to protect. We covered that a little bit earlier, but we use like where you're inside Word and Citrix. They don't have a desktop or anything, right? They click Open File. You just navigate to the command exe, hit go, and it launches the command shell. Now we generate our PowerShell Empire payload, paste that in, shoot it through, and then back on our listening Kali box out there in the cloud, it catches the shell running as that host. And then from there, we start our whole enumeration phase, which is query the domain admins, look for the domain controllers, find where that user has local admin access, run Bloodhound to see if you've got any attack paths currently. After you run Bloodhound, didn't have any attack paths. Okay, so we're going to see where we have local admin access. A big problem is that the users all complain like, hey, I want local admin on my box. And the easy way is just to add all domain users to local admin groups, and then they've got local admin all over the place. So now I can take that account and just Mimikatz all the other boxes. So you run Mimikatz on a few other boxes you have local admin on, get new credentials, check it in Bloodhound. If you don't have anything, keep going with their credentials where they have local admin. Ran it a couple times actually to actually get to the environment we needed to be, where we had a path to domain admin. And from there, it's just jump into that box. Don't even take that domain admin's password, but just impersonate their user, and then just run DC sync, and it's game over. And like, you can say that all, and it looks like it would go really quick, and it would if you'd known that whole path from the beginning. but that does end up taking a little while, and that's kind of where that whole enumeration phase is like where we spend the most time, and that's trying to find those attack paths. And that's why if you have domain admins logged in all over the place, it really reduces that time down to hardly anything, where we only have to go one hop, and we've got DA creds. So for detection of attackers, some of the stuff you can kind of set up alerting on. It's not too difficult. That shouldn't be happening a lot. Like I'm trying not to make you guys have like tons of events coming in, but you can look at the sensitive security group modifications. The lateral movement thing is like ATA is detecting that really well now after it's been running for like 3 or 4 weeks. But like that's the whole like if Bob's PS execing all over the place, why is that happening? Like something's suspicious here. Domain controller promotions, that shouldn't happen that often, so it's something worth putting an event log on. Group policy modifications might happen more often, but something you can check at. The privileged account authentications. Ideally, you're not using privileged accounts like for most of your work, so they shouldn't be authenticating that much. Account lockouts en masse. A lot of people just look at the account lockouts en masse, but they forget to look at failed account logins en masse. That's something like you can kind of key off of where, as a smart attacker, I don't want to lock out accounts, so I'm only going to try one password on all the users I have once every like 2 hours or so. It's actually pretty quick, and most people throttle their account lockouts pretty well because they just don't want to deal with service tickets of people locking themselves out. But that's something you can look for, especially if it's like to one particular box. No box should be having 50 even of your users trying to authenticate to it at one time. Some of the easy wins for going home and working on your Active Directory that really, they're not going to like solve all the problems, but they really make our job a lot harder. Which is the DAs being everywhere is clear. SMB signing, a lot of people don't have SMB signing enabled, and there's not really a reason you shouldn't. It does break some older printers, I think, is the only thing I've heard from anyone that set that up, because like they don't support that. But SMB signing will prevent any of those relay attacks, so they can't just be a rogue device on your network using responder to auth the things. Local admin password reuse. This one's pretty bad in a lot of places, especially if they have a lot of devices. They basically set up one like golden image to flash all the new laptops that come in for any new employee, but the local admin user has the same password. So if I dump that on one box, I can locally admin into all the machines on the network and then just run Mimikatz, and I'll get those domain users that are logged in. And so like something like Labs, like Microsoft has, you can implement, and it's fairly easy to use and really makes things a lot harder. And the same thing with, you can disable local admin account remote access. It's just a setting. And that basically prevents any of the PS exec type attacks from happening, where I would have to RDP into every one of those machines. Overprivileged domain user accounts. There's really not a reason that your domain users need local admin everywhere. I get it if they need it like on one machine, like their host, maybe another, but there's no reason just to kind of be lazy and just give it to everyone all over the place. And then the service accounts in the DA group, we talked about a little bit, but there's backup accounts that think they need DA everywhere, or they need to be part of the DA group, but you can set up specific groups so they only have rights to do what they need to do, you know? Default creds on internal hosts. We see this one a lot too, and I usually like hate finding these because you have to write up just so many of these things, because everyone thinks like, oh, it's the internal network, I can leave Tomcat and root on like every device. But if I don't have a direct path to domain admin when I get in, I'm going to first check those things, because I don't want to use exploits, because they're going to trigger alerts and antivirus, things like that. I'm going to try the easy stuff that wouldn't trigger anything. And just because it's your internal network, you might have malicious users inside. And these kind of go in an escalating of ease to implement, I think. The next one is there's a setting where you can prevent the storing or caching of credentials, which you may or may not want to do. The only problem is that it will prevent domain accounts from being able to log in when they don't have access to a domain controller. And then reducing privileged group members. Far too often I find domain admin groups where if I query the domain admins group and it's like a whole page, like something's wrong there, like not that many people should be domain admins. They might need permissions for certain things. There's better ways to do that than just giving them full domain admin rights. And then kind of getting into harder to implement everywhere, like tomorrow, things would be like multi-factor on the outside, on everything you can possibly implement it on. Because the one thing you don't implement it on is where I'm going to log into. And that really stops the easy stuff, so then I have to come up with like a real exploit to break in, right? Because password guessing, getting into the networks is like just one of the easiest ways to get in, but multi-factor really shuts that down quick. And it can help also your users know like, hey, someone keeps authenticating and I keep on getting two-factor requests on my phone, but I'm not authenticating anywhere. And then network segmentation, where you can prevent different, like set up VLANs so that users can't even get somewhere else. That way I can't just be spraying PSExec across the network with some passwords. And then a little bit of cleanup, stale user accounts where there's no activity, no password changes, and they've never logged on. They were maybe set up with the default password at the beginning. That person never joined the company or whatever, but like we do like Active Directory audits, and we'll find a lot of these stale user accounts around, and there's just no reason. You can just delete them. They don't need to be there. The overprivileged service accounts is another big one. And then non-expiring passwords. A lot of domain admins don't like that, but on service accounts especially, like someone set up a password on a service account, set it to never expire, because it does break things sometimes if the password changes. But like say that domain admin left, now no one really knows that password, it's going to stay the same forever, and that just opens you up for these really long-term brute force password guessing kind of stuff. I wanted to talk a second about like using paid products and commercial products to do this. Like I'm a big fan actually of all Microsoft stuff. Like if you're on their latest, greatest, enterprise, everything, it's really tough to beat. Most of the commercial products just make things take a lot longer, or not really that much longer, but just kind of make my shells act a little funny sometimes. They do usually have better alerting systems set up, which is good. It'll help you identify users at least. But it's that same, like, if you've got these great tools set up and you bought these things, but it's too hard to fully implement them, then they're not going to really work how they were sold to you as. We see a lot of times people have products that would have stopped things, but like they got along the line somewhere and just never fully implemented it, and then it's just like, why spend all the money on that product if you're not going to use it the way it was intended? And then just to remember, there's always a bypass for all these things. I mean, that's been proven years and years and years. And so you just always need to be aware. That's why I think Microsoft's moved to the whole assumed breach. Like, even they get it. Like, it's too hard to protect against everything with any protection. And just always be aware that any of your users could be malicious at any time. And it kind of changes the whole mindset of how you're approaching your security. I didn't really go through, I thought about maybe for next time, some of these, so we talked about those attack paths and discovering them. Well, people started being like, well, I've gotten pretty used to jumping into a network, running Bloodhound, following that attack path and getting DA, why don't I just automate that? And so there's a lot of these tools coming out that basically, as soon as I have credentials, I can just like one click and just wait 10 minutes for DA to come back. There's like Death Star, which basically starts with Responder to try to get some creds. It's all Python based. It runs along using Empire shells back and forth in CrackMap. It doesn't run Bloodhound, but it just tries the same thing Bloodhound does and just quickly just navigates to your network. GoFetch basically takes a Bloodhound attack path and tells Cobalt Strike to just execute it. And so like once they get in, they run Bloodhound, they feed it to GoFetch, and then they've got domain admin. Angry Puppy is kind of the same thing, and there's a Empire Dog one. But there's just more and more of these tools coming out. Like, I don't recommend using them as an attacker because they can be kind of, I mean, they're not like really smart, because they're just going to shell like every box that user have access to and mimikatz all of them, and so they can just really quickly like worm through your network. But they are out there and they're making these things a lot quicker. Then I've got lots and lots of references for a lot of this research from all these talks that people can go through and look at if they want. That was kind of the roadmap. I thought about a part 5. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that with like PostX and like going over some of those automation tools and maybe talking about ways of exfiltrating data out the network and then avoiding detection and some of the really stealthy persistence methods. But I'm not sure if we're going to do that. Maybe. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Here's part 5.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
I definitely would be interested in a talk about exfiltration.
Yeah, okay.
But could you briefly talk about some strategies to protect your backups? You talked about being able to see backups on a file share somewhere.
Yeah, that's usually when we just find that like they'll have file shares that are publicly readable or publicly writable, and then you can use them for lateral movement actually, but it's just storing those in secured shares that only certain users have access to, and then running something even like Bloodhound to make sure where you can put in the resource afterwards and it'll tell you to make sure you don't have any inherited rights. A lot of times they're stored just in shares that they don't think anyone can access, but along the road sometime there was a group nested inside another group that this domain user's in, and then they've got this path to get there. And those are really hard to find yourself, and that's why Bloodhound and the ACL collection method has kind of helped that a lot. But it's those like, really the one I'm talking about is like when they're just publicly accessible. Like I've even found like where they were keeping their like credit card, like all the transaction databases were being written to a publicly accessible share, and so you could just jump in, anyone could read it. They just were like, well, we needed all these servers to write to this share, but it's like, we'll only give those servers that access, you know, and things like that. Yeah. Anything? Yeah.
So, you talk about limiting and breaking up your privileges for domain admins.
Yeah.
So, your domain admin probably has a domain admin account, a regular user account. How many other accounts do you think they really need?
They really only need that other account, and then it's a little more painstaking to set up like just enough administration profiles for everything you do. But if you can use those, or just PowerShell remoting from, I think they talked about in the news even, the privileged access workstations, the PAWs or PAMs. If you could just limit where your DA takes his creds with him, that's kind of the goal. And that's where Microsoft recommends the PowerShell remoting, and then even tighter with using like the constrained modes, so that they can only do so much when they get there. But it'll just prevent you from bringing delegated tickets with you, so that if I take them, if it's only impersonation tickets that I can steal, then I can only do things on that local box as a DA. But if you're taking all your credentials with you by like logging in or any kind of thing that requires actual you to send your credentials, I can steal that hash or ticket and basically be able to access anything else in the domain. And so it's really just about only logging into your workstation and then securely remoting into anything else. If that makes sense.
It seems like, let's say you got 1,000 servers. Instead of having domain admin access to all 1,000 servers, you break it up into like 10 accounts. This account has access to 100 servers. This account has access to 100 servers. So segment it kind of that way. But you don't.
Yeah, I mean, like.
You don't recommend anything.
That should be a lot of accounts for you to juggle.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
That kind of thing, and that's where like, yeah, it's like painstaking to set up, I guess, because you'd be doing almost the same amount of setup to just set up those remote sessions. Actually, you'd be doing maybe less, because you could just give that user, you could just copy that session profile, and whenever you PowerShell remote, you'd use that session profile for those servers. Yeah. And I know, yeah, I mean, like, I totally get why domain admins do like log in to a lot of places, just because it's so hard to have what you need there and like know what you're going to need there set up in profiles beforehand. But I guess everyone we've seen do it is just so much more secure, like where it just is, like we can't find domain admin creds anywhere, you know? And the problem with that too is like, if you securely remote in, even if you have every other user has domain admin rights or local admin rights on that box, even if I can steal the hash and creds there, you won't have an actual password there, and the hash you have, I can't pass anywhere. But yeah, I mean, like I don't do domain admin work, so I also don't know like exactly how tough it is. That's mostly just from everything Microsoft's been telling in all their kind of documentation. And they really recommend just enough administration, but again, that just like even more limits what your user can do once he gets there, and you have to really painstakingly set up all those little profiles.
I got a question. What are some good like detective and investigative tools that can be utilized to look for those that have gotten EA creds?
Well, like without going into like, I guess like products, I really like what ATP is becoming. That's kind of like the next iteration. They've had ATP like 3 different times. They've like Microsoft's announced it, that it's advanced threat protection. This latest one for the enterprise users kind of combines all their stuff together. It's got like credential guard, network guard, app guard, EMET, and it's got the firewall built in, and it's all like on a control panel. And it basically is running like ATA on every single device individually, and then they all feed ATA also. And then ATA is kind of something you can put in that will detect a lot of different of these attacks, like at least with pass the hash, anytime a golden ticket gets created, or after it's been running for like 3 or 4 weeks, it has done enough learning on the network to see like what users typically do in their work, and then it'll notify you for a suspicious activity like, hey, this user has never jumped in this box before. ATA is pretty good in the fact that it also, like, if I even do like a DNS enumeration inside the network, ATA will pick that up. Or if I query for all the users, ATA just assumes that like no one should be asking for every user account like at any time. And so you can look into that. It does require like you to be on Microsoft's enterprise everything, which is expensive for a lot of people. I don't know why they offer like all their protections as like the most expensive thing, but that's Microsoft for you, I guess.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Follow on that. What ATA does it also detect suspicious access to file shares?
Yeah.
Rights to it or not?
I think I've got a slide of it actually. Yeah, ATA detects, so I guess, everything on that page, but it's a whole lot of stuff. The only problem with ATA currently, and the team recognizes this, their talk they just gave at Blue Hat IL was really good about all the new stuff coming. They recognize that ATA is only as good as someone that's looking at it. It detects most of the malicious activities, but someone has to be there like looking at it to know. And they're going to work, and it doesn't actually do anything about them. It just tells you, like, hey, this was suspicious. They're working on making it actually be able to contain things in events, so that when an event triggers, you can click and like remove that user's access just for until you can investigate the product or investigate what's going on.
But you have alarm exhaustion.
Yeah, and that's. Yeah, I mean that's kind of like what they were tentative to like put any of that, like they don't want it to automatically do anything, so they think it'll just wreck networks. But they're definitely working on that and like getting there, so at least it'll empower you to quickly prevent what's going on. Because I think their big complaint now is just like, okay, well I know this user is bad, what do I do about it? Like how do I act fast enough to get him out? And so that's what they're looking into. Any other questions? Maybe you can just hit me on the side after here. And I think that's it for me. I will say I'm teaching a cross-site scripting workshop coming up, but thanks guys.